We'd been on the line near Mons long enough for days and nights to smear together until time felt like wet clay pressed into a trench wall. The mud learned our names, climbed our leggings, stole our heat, and never gave any of it back. The duckboards flexed under us like tired ribs whenever someone shifted his weight. The walls wept, even when the sky didn't. I was Corporal Thomas Hensley, B Company, 1st Battalion, Royal Fusiliers. My gear was always damp, my rifle never truly dry, and my tin of meat stayed closed because the smell mixed too well with cordite and rot. We lived by the simple measures of the line: stand to at dawn and dusk, clean the bolt, scrape the firing step, check the wire, try to sleep while the ground kept breathing with the far artillery. The talk started the way bad weather does, rolling in quiet from the flanks. A mate in a sister unit swore a listening patrol didn't come back. 3 men, careful lads. They found him at first light, lying in a shallow crater, just on our side of the wrecked wire. Not blown, not cut, torn in a way that didn't line up with what steel or blast usually does. The details stuck like burrs, no neat trail of blood, marks at the throat too wide for a man, faces set like they'd gone to shout with nothing left in them to push air. Tate said trench stories grow in mud faster than wheat in spring, and laughed because someone had to. Sykes crossed himself when he thought nobody saw. Holloway listened with his hands tucked under his arms the way a man fights cold and thinks about something else. I told him to keep it down before the lieutenant wandered past, but a story doesn't stop at an order. It climbs the ladder with you. It sits in the next bay. It lies on the duckboards where you plant your feet. That night, the low ground silvered with frost, and the wire took on a black shine. I drew the 2 to 4. We stood quiet with our cheeks to the wood, breath thin in the cold. At around 3 I heard it, a howl. Not farm dog lonely, not the sharp cry foxes throw across the fields. Lower, heavier, tuned wrong. It wasn't loud, it was close. It worked its way into my jaw like a vibration. Tate said dogs under his breath, and I told him to keep his eyes on the wire. I eased the safety and sent up a flare. The washed-out light climbed and turned the craters into slick bowls of ink. Nothing moved. The light died, and the dark settled heavier than before. The sound didn't come again, but the sense remained. The one you get when a thing out there knows you've noticed it. Orders steady a man until the new ones arrive. Ours came just before midnight the next evening. We were to put 4 across no man's land, see what the Germans were doing with their forward trench opposite our sector, and get back without being brave. I named the team, and nobody argued. Holloway, Sykes, Tate, and me. We rubbed out shine with soot, wrapped the cutters so they wouldn't chatter, checked knives, shifted extra rounds to where they wouldn't clack. I gave Sykes the flare pistol with 2 cartridges and told him not to fire unless I said. He nodded too fast. We went over at 1, bellies down, hands cold through the wool. The ground carried the stale smell you get where iron, mud, and blood have been mixing a long time. We skirted a crater that swallowed what little light we had, slid under a limbless trunk that pointed up like a spear, and reached the first apron of wire. The cutters ticked in my hands until I made them quiet. I listened. No challenge. No tin clatter on a tripline, no whisper across from us. We opened a mouth just big enough for a man to exhale and slide through. Halfway, the air shifted. Not wind, a mean inch of colder air that sank into the sleeves. The rats went still. I didn't hear the howl this time. I felt it in the boards behind my teeth. Sykes lifted his head and froze. Out past the wire, at that distance where your eyes start making their own decisions, something stood, low to the ground, long through the shoulder, the size you don't see on farms. The edges kept softening and firming as the mist moved. I set my front sight on where a chest ought to be. No, Holloway breathed, barely a sound. I held. The shape shifted sideways, not running. More like when you change your angle and lose a thing altogether. The place it had been looked wetter than the ground around it. We lay quiet a long half-minute and then worked on, boots and elbows finding their own slow rhythm. We found the German trench by the new smell of turned earth and a pinpoint of tobacco that winked out as soon as I looked for it. No voices carried, no scrape. Whoever faced us was holding breath. 20 paces shy, Tate set his weight and his boot went into something soft. He pulled free with a wet sound. I reached ahead and met cloth, leather, the stiff edge of a leg wrap. A man, face up, British. The tags were gone. My fingers slid at the throat and came back, sticky. It wasn't a clean cut. It wasn't shrapnel. The flat, a small metallic tap came from their side. Someone bumping something and freezing. I pressed my hand flat for silence. A flare went up somewhere behind our lines and spilled chalk light over the field, turning the wire to pale bone. In that brief glare, something came up out of a shallow pool to our right. For a second, I thought it was the shadow of a stump. Then I saw the head lift and turn in our direction. Bigger than any dog I'd seen in service. Shoulders too heavy, muzzle too long for the breeds I knew. It stood a second longer than felt decent for two sides lying that close, then eased down and away. I fired. The muzzle jump drove the stock into my shoulder. Mud lifted where I wanted the shot to land, and the thing vanished into the dark like it had never been there. A scrape sounded behind us, then another to the left. Sykes' breath kept climbing until I set my hand on his back. The field settled into that kind of quiet that makes a man hunt his own pulse. Something moved through the hole we cut, not hurrying, the way something tests a gap before it commits. We were still when it came. When the last of the flare washed out, the field belonged to the dark again, and the weight hit Holloway. He went down hard, and air came out of him in a flat sound. I swung the rifle like a club and hit something that didn't answer like bone, more like a beam that soaked under rain for a season. I drove steel forward where a chest should have been, and the point skidded off wet hide and found nothing worth staying in. It turned on me quicker than I braced for, and the smell of it was the old kitchen fat stink you get when a pan hasn't been right for weeks. Teeth closed on the fore end and chewed the wood fast. Tate fired too tight. We pulled back by inches, dragging Holloway by his webbing, elbows digging channels in the crusted frost. Sykes fired his flare without waiting, and the field came back to the look we trusted. Wire as wire, stumps as stumps, mud as mud. Nothing stood inside that light. Either it had moved, or the light had washed it out. We got through our gap, dropped into a hole we hadn't marked on the way out, and lay with our faces in the cold. Something paced the rim. I listened for the rhythm of a normal dog, and didn't hear it. Every third step landed wrong, like one leg measured distance different from the others. It stopped. A voice from their trench shouted once and a rifle answered, and then everything settled again. We worked back slow, the kind of crawl that makes every foot feel like a yard. Our parapet never looked better. Hands caught webbing and pulled us in. The lieutenant met us in the traverse, read our faces before he asked, then asked anyway. I gave him what I could use, and nothing I couldn't. Forward trench quiet, One of ours found dead in no man's land with injuries at the throat not typical of bullets or blast. Contact with large animals while returning. He nodded like a man nods at rain.
I kept our mouths tight. The adjutant liked clean sentences and columns that added. I was good at that. Date said it was feral dogs or something the Germans were training. Sykes stopped sleeping when the ground went quiet and started watching the wire even when it wasn't his turn. For a handful of nights the same sound came and went, and we worked like we were walking on glass. Then, as fine as flicking a switch, it ended. No more howling that rolled in under the duckboards. No more bodies found where they shouldn't be. The patrol orders didn't change, but our shoulders sat easier, because that's how men are. We fought on across the same strip of map, with different names pinned to it. Winter pressed into spring, then into the wet year after, and everything kept its slow pace. Rations, mail, lice, scrape, stand to. You still saw more than you could back away. Bodies cooked by a shell fire. You could smell before you could see. Men pulled down by mud that looked shallow from the lip. Masks on late by one breath. Eyes gone pale. The job teaches you what's possible and then keeps teaching, even when you've learned enough. In the fall of 17, a German shell lifted me out of my place and set me down wrong. The leg went hot, the world went white, and when it narrowed back to the dressing station, I found the guns were still going outside, and the noise in my head had gone quiet. They shipped me rearward with the papers you get when you won't be coming back to the bay you kept for so long. I held them and thought about one winter near Mons, when the air felt colder by a degree that didn't belong to weather, and something big worked the ground, the way heavy things do when they don't care who notices. Back then, one of ours wrote what he'd seen straight and took it to the medical officer. They put him on a train with a label that said what labels say when a man's nerves snap. He never came back either. I learned the lesson you only need once. I told the book what it could hold. Positions, rounds, a timed flare that went up and fell, and kept the rest where it belonged, between the boards, under the mud, in the part of a man that doesn't do much talking. Years later, I can give you the figures on what a gun does to bone, and the color a man turns when the mask isn't sealed. I can tell you how long it takes for a name to vanish from a roll, and how long boots wait for feet that won't come. But if I wake in the small hours listening for anything at all, it isn't the guns. It isn't shouting. It's for a low sound that works its way up through ground and timber until it sits on your teeth, and for the weight of something moving where nothing living should be moving. Nothing else I saw in the whole war.